Thanks. I'm Don Goodman-Wilson. I guess you need to be putting on your headphones now because you probably can't hear me, especially you in the back. I'll give you just a moment to do that while I talk about myself. I'm a developer advocate at GitHub. I do lots of things in this role, but one of my favorite things is working with open source communities and open source maintainers. And so I want to do a talk today about open source. But really, I'd much rather talk about two of my favorite things. I have many favorite things, but I want to talk about Chinese food. A good thing this talk is after lunch because we're going to get hungry. And I want to talk about motor scooters. And I want to talk about the things that they have in common with open source development and lessons that we could learn about how to do open source development better. So like I said, I want to talk about open source. I'm a big fan of open source. I think that that's a problem. What happened? I have to restart Keynote. That's what happened. Bear with me. That's not embarrassing. Thank you. All right, let's try that again. I want to talk about open source development. I want to talk about the models that we use to structure the projects that we work on. So I don't want to talk about code, but I want to talk about human organization. And I want to do this in the context of this belief that I have that open source is sick. I'm a child of the 90s. I'm really big into open source. I've watched its rise. I've watched its growth. And I desperately think that it's sick. Wow. This is super weird. I don't know what's going on. There's the slide again. So I think it's sick. And we see this in the way that MongoDB and AWS are butting heads. We see this in the event stream incident in NPM just last month, in which Bitcoin mining software was injected into multiple people's backends. Right? We see this in the left pad debacle of a few years ago. And I think that there's a common cause to many of the illnesses that we see. It's not the only cause. There's lots of stories that we could tell here, but I think one of the causes is that we rely very heavily on a centralized structure for open source development, right? That we approach this from a very egocentric model, right? Where we identify projects with the people who create them, and that this often leads to problems. This is not working. What do we do about it? Here's what I'm going to try. We're just going to mirror my display instead. And we're going to lose my presenter notes. Let's try it one more time. All right, so I think the problem is that we have a very egocentric notion of what it means to structure a software development project, right? And that we strongly identify projects with their creators, right? And that this is uniquely the product of a specifically white, cis, hetero, male culture, right? That we want to know the guy who's responsible, the ideally probably white guy who's responsible. And I want to argue in this talk that there are other ways to do this, but we have to move beyond this egocentric model that comes from white, cis, hetero, male culture. But that when we do that, all sorts of fascinating things open up to us in terms of how we can structure our projects successfully. So I want to preface everything that I'm going to say by this. I have no idea what I'm doing. The things I'm going to talk about are not things that I'm a specialist in. I hope there are historians out there who do know where I can find primary source material for some of the things that I'm going to talk about. Some of you in this room will have experience with some of the things that I'm going to talk about, and I hope to have conversations with you about that. This talk is highly experimental. This talk is highly we're going to go out into left field. So I also want to say that the views that I'm going to express in this talk do not represent the views of my employer, GitHub. They're mine and mine alone. But they're a hell of a lot of fun. So let's talk about forking, right? I think forking is sort of at the basis of the centralization of projects. So there's this interesting tension in open source software, right? On one hand, central to the very idea of open source is the idea that we can make copies, and we can make copies freely, and we can do what we want with these copies, right? This is encoded in many of the licenses. The copyleft license, GPL, all the licenses touch on some aspect of the freedom to copy, right? That's why we call it copyleft. It's not copyright. We're not reserving the rights. We're handing you the rights to make the copy. But on the other hand, since the 90s, forking has been, we're done with you, Linus. It's been a bad thing. It's been called a bad thing, right? Eric S. Raymond is very famous for in the very earliest days of the open source movement, saying forking is terrible, right? It's not good for the projects because it creates strife where there ought not be any, right? And so I see two reasons. One, there are technical issues, right? Like once a project forks, we have to find a way to merge the contents back together. That can be very difficult to do, especially when there's wide divergence in the forks. But now that we have distributed version control systems like, I don't know, Git, this is largely a non-issue, right? We know how to solve this problem. This was an issue in the 90s. It is not an issue now. The other issue is power conflicts, right? At the center of every major open source project is an ego and a struggle for power. Forking, right, is inherently a statement of dissent to that power, right? And to the extent that those in charge want to consolidate power, that's appropriate. They're going to frown on forking. This is going to keep happening unless I restart the presentation. So give me just a moment. I have to restart it from the beginning, interestingly enough. I ran into this problem earlier. Fast forward. This is not really good enough ground to me to say forking is bad, right? Dissent is good. Sticking it to power is good. Questioning authority is good, right? But the way that projects are structured right now make that very difficult by design. So let's talk about other ways that we can structure our projects so we can move beyond these two particular difficulties. We can make forking free and open and easy to do. And let's do it for a number of reasons. Like why do we want to do this? Like maybe we don't actually want to do this. Motivate this, Don. Wrong slide. What are we gonna do? Okay, so there are 4 possible outcomes from a fork. Sorry, this is the one thing I wanted to argue first that have been suggested in the past. 1, the fork dies. 2, the fork merges with the original, as in the case with EGCS and GCC. There's the death of the original, right? X386 died in favor of X.org, or you end up with 2 competing projects like libc and glibc, right? I think, and this is the best argument besides conflicts of power, although these are all inherently conflicts of power, against forking. But I want to say there's more possibilities in this. There are way more possibilities than just these 4. But these are the 4 that people commonly refer to. And I want to get there by decentralizing, right? That's the key theme of this talk, is that if we think the problem lies in centralization, then the cure lies in decentralization. And when we decentralize, we get a bunch of things. 1, we get the removal of ego, right? That's exactly what it means to decentralize in this case. When we remove the ego, we remove the gatekeepers. When we remove the gatekeepers, access to contribution becomes democratized. When we have democratized access to contribution, we get increased diversity of experience and opinion. We get better software, right? And we get better localized product market fit in particular, because we don't have one product that's attempting to solve a range of problems. We get a range of competing products that, well, not competing, but a range of products that can be tailored specifically to localized market conditions, and so we get better software. So I'm going to talk about this in the context of a couple of fun things, and the first is Chinese food. Specifically American Chinese food. So how many of you have had American Chinese food from America? Maybe a fair number of you. So those of you who don't know, American Chinese food is different from the Chinese food you get here in the Netherlands. It's different from the Chinese food you get in Japan. It's different from the Chinese food that you get in China. It's thick, it's starchy, it's sweet. It is freaking delicious. I love it. But I'm an American, so of course I do, because it's been specifically engineered to cater to my tastes as an American. There are a remarkable number, we'll come to the exact number in a moment, of Chinese restaurants in the United States. And they all cater, not all, there's some diversity here, but for the most part, they cater to American tastes. And I think it's quite fascinating that there are so many restaurants all doing the same thing. Any of them that you walk into is going to have a menu that looks exactly like this. If you've never seen an American Chinese restaurant menu before, here it is. I don't know where this is from, doesn't matter. It could be literally from any of them. I know everything that's on this menu. I know what my favorites are. The really interesting thing about this is that the menus are so consistent, that the tastes are so consistent, right? That wherever you go in the United States, you're going to get the same kind of experience. So by comparison, this is explicitly the goal of McDonald's, right? McDonald's was created explicitly to create a restaurant experience that was consistent regardless of which McDonald's you went to. A McDonald's burger is a McDonald's burger is a McDonald's burger. And they are amazing at achieving that goal. Think what you will about McDonald's, like the consistency is incredible. They have a very highly centralized chain for supplying ingredients, for supplying recipes, for supplying training. And at scale in the United States, they've managed to open almost 14,000 stores, although this number has been flat, even declining in recent years, right? This is an incredible achievement. Chinese food has been around about 50 years longer than McDonald's has in the United States. It has achieved very similar levels of consistency, but each store is independently owned and operated. There is no central distribution network for ingredients, right? There's no central place they all go to get trained, but there are 41,000 of them. Oh, come on, really? 41,000 of them. This is an incredible achievement, right? We have a product specifically tailored for an audience with an amazing amount of consistency, with very little central coordination, with 41,000 locations in the United States. How did we get there? The answer is chop suey. So chop suey is not something you're going to find in Europe. It's not something you're going to find in China outside of Guangdong province. In the early 1900s, Chinese immigrants to the United States largely came from Guangdong province to work in the gold fields in the California mountains. They were part of the original gold rush. There's a tech connection here, I suppose. And they brought with them their recipes, and they adapted their recipes to the locally available ingredients, and then they began to cook them for others, and then they started opening up shops, and by and large, Americans rejected what they found. They thought Chinese food was nasty, right? But some enterprising souls in New York City, ruined my slide. This is actually San Francisco, but it spread quite quickly. Figured out that chop suey was actually something that appealed to Americans. Like, Americans would eat this. And so they started serving it to Americans and watching their reaction and tailoring the recipes. And between 1910 and 1930, there was almost year over year doubling in growth in Chinese restaurants in America, from basically like 4 to a ridiculously large number, as they figured out they could sell chop suey to Americans. The Chinese Exclusion Act was passed in, I forget the year because I don't have my slide notes, so forgive me, but not too long after this, I think 1915, and that halted Chinese immigration to the United States, and it almost halted the growth of Chinese restaurants. But in 1965, a new act was passed that revoked it, and crucially, Nixon went to China. The President of the United States restored normalized political relations with China and, most importantly, ate Chinese food on live TV from China. This sparked a huge interest in Chinese food. Like, oh, there's more than chop suey? There are other things that we could eat? In the meantime, with the opening of the borders, more immigrants came to the United States from other regions in China that brought their own recipes with them. And they began the same model of looking for those recipes that Americans liked, adapting the recipes that they had on hand, and stocking that menu. So that menu that I showed you earlier actually represents dishes from all over China. Lots of different cultures, lots of different cuisines, as they just sort of mish and mash things together to suit the American palate. I'm going to kill that thing. This is General Tso's chicken. This is probably the most famous American Chinese dish of the age. This does not exist more or less outside of the US. It certainly does not exist in China. This is the dish that they figured out Americans will eat more of than anything else. It's a sweet and sour and slightly spicy sauce wrapped around crispy, deep-fried nuggets of chicken. Oh my God, it is good. They're not wrong. Recent commentators have been kind of obsessed with, like, where did this come from? Who originated this dish? Like, how does this spread? I think asking questions about the origin of the dish are misguided, right? We're looking for that ego at the center of the project, and we want to attribute credit to this one person who invented the dish. Turns out there's an answer, but I'm not going to tell you what it is. Because I'm more interested in the question of, okay, so somebody invented it, great. How did it spread to 41,000 restaurants? It's an incredible achievement. So it turns out the answer lies in America's troubled history with immigration. So let's see if I can do this. Right up here, this store, the Shanghai Association of America Incorporated, it's not a store, it's an association, is an organization 120 years old. There are dozens like it across the United States. This is just one of them. And they set up shop to help the Chinese immigrants navigate America's god-awful immigration system, and it's never been very good. But to do more than that, to help them settle, help them have normal lives in America, help them find jobs, help them find careers, help them raise their families. And so they became the center of a network of entrepreneurship and information exchange among Chinese immigrants to America. They still exist. And one of the things that they do is, if you're a Chinese immigrant coming to America, you'll seek out one of these places, and they have a network that's going to help you. They're going to find a job that suits your skills. They're going to find places where there are no Chinese restaurants where you can open one. They keep close relationships, in fact, with the network of Chinese restaurants in the United States. So at any given moment, they can tell you exactly where there's demand for a new Chinese restaurant, and they can tell you where there's demand for a new cook. And best of all, they can tell you what the best recipes are. Because if you're a Chinese restaurant, it's in your interest to innovate, create new recipes. And when you do find something that your customers like, I don't know, General Tso's chicken, what do you do with it? You write into the association that you're affiliated with, share that recipe with them. They publish it in their membership newspaper that goes out to all of the restaurants in their organization, right? That recipe is shared. It's open source. It's freely copied. Everybody gets access to it. Everybody now is making this improved dish. Everybody can test to see if it works with their audience. And when it does, it spreads. That's really powerful. That's incredibly powerful. In our culture, the aim is to keep secrets to ourselves, to keep these gains for ourselves. But in their culture, the goal is twofold. One is to reduce risk. You can reduce the risk of innovation by spreading the cost around. But the other thing is, that my slides don't work, but the other thing is that now that's thrown me off. What was the other gain? Well, we'll come back to it. So what are the takeaways that we can learn from this organization of Chinese food? The first is that copies are cheap. It costs restaurants nothing to send their recipes in. Oh, I remember what the other thing is. To the degree that Americans continue to like Chinese food because they've had a good experience at one restaurant, they're more likely to eat at the other restaurants, right? Chinese food, as I mentioned, has a storied history in the United States. It was not always popular, but if there are delicious dishes and new delicious dishes coming out, Americans are more likely to continue to have a favorable attitude towards it, right? So there's this uphill battle to be fought. So copies are cheap. They cost you nothing, and you gain a lot from them. Share excess demand. When you know you have a good thing, share it with your neighbor, right? They benefit from it, and then you both benefit together. You spread around the risk of innovation, and you get, in turn, reciprocity from your neighbors. Finally, decentralized production. So there are central clearinghouses of information on this model, but these centralized clearinghouses don't create the recipes, right? They're just tracking demand, they're tracking what's popular, and they're sharing that information. They're merely distributing information. The actual production, the invention of the recipes, the cooking of the food itself, the development of the menu and the pricing and all like that is handled individually at each of these individual restaurants, right? So we have radically decentralized production. And it's worked. It works really well. It's the most successful restaurant model probably on the face of the planet. But maybe that's too much centralization for you, right? Maybe having this clearinghouse is not going far enough. So let's talk about motor scooters, or bromfietsen and snorfietsen, because we're in the Netherlands, or just scooters. I'm going to call them motor scooters. I'm a scooter head. I used to have a bunch of them. I don't anymore. my motorcycle license is not valid here in the Netherlands, so I'm somewhat sad. Motor scooters and their ilk are the most popular form of transportation on the planet, right? They're cheap, they're reliable, they're readily available, they're small, right? They don't need a lot of space for storage. And at the moment, you may have noticed, if you look out in the streets of Amsterdam, or the streets of San Francisco, or the streets of Beijing, most of the motor scooters that you see were made in factories in China. They're not brands that you would recognize. They're not Piaggio or Vespa. They're not Honda or Yamaha. They may not even have a brand on them at all. Chinese scooters have completely taken over the marketplace for motor scooters. And that's not a small task, and it's happened in only the last 20 years. It's really quite an amazing innovation. And this innovation is due to this guy. That's a motor scooter engine. It's a motor scooter engine made in China called the GY6. The GY6 is a platform for innovation, I think, unlike seen before, ever. Right? That's just a 50cc motor scooter. But this thing is powering an economic innovation of incredible size. So motor scooters became popular in Asia, in particular with the introduction of the Honda Cub. This is a 120cc, not quite a motorcycle, not quite a scooter, first created in 1958. It is the most popular motor vehicle ever created. More of these have been sold than any other single model of vehicle ever. And it's still in production. You can buy one today. Not in the United States, but everywhere else in the world. For most of the 20th century, this was one of the ideal forms of transportation, especially in rural Asia. It has large wheels. It can go over rough terrain as a result of it, right? Wow. It's great for on-road and off-road use. It gets you around. But with the increasing urbanization of China and other countries in Asia and the increased demand for more efficient modes of transportation in the US and Europe, and in the 1980s, production largely switched to this style of scooter, right, modeled on the Vespa. This is a Honda from the 2000s. What makes this more interesting for the urban scooter is the smaller wheels, make it easier to take tight curves. It's got a trunk right here. It seats two, so you can carry stuff around it and your friends as well. And so it's much more practical for getting around the city. And these became very popular in the 1980s, and they continue to be very popular today. But chances are you've probably seen this guy running around. You see these all over the United States at the very least, right? It looks very similar. It's derogatorily called a Chinese clone. This cheap knockoff that's entered the market in order to make a fast buck off of this trend. That's usually how you hear it described in the American media. I see this as a miracle of democratization because it's cheap, it's reliable, it's a lot cheaper than the Honda. And the reason is the GY6 engine. So in the 1980s, new environmental regulations required the reduction of emissions from engines. And at the time, scooters were using two-stroke engines, right? The sort. They literally spew gasoline into the atmosphere, right? They're shit for the environment. And so manufacturers had to move to a four-stroke model, which is more environmentally friendly, but significantly more complex to manufacture, significantly more complex to maintain, and thereby also a lot more expensive, right? So this Honda model on the right is a lot more expensive than it ought to be because environmental regulation pressure required a more expensive engine to go into it. With the GY6, which we'll come back to in a moment, it's much cheaper to produce. It's still a four-stroke, it still meets these environmental regulations, but there's a key innovation that made it very cheap to manufacture, and that's sort of what's powering what's going on over here. How did this come to be? Why did the GY6 platform, and I'll describe it again in more detail, how did it come to dominate the motor scooter market? There's no documentation on this. The origins of the GY6 engine are shrouded in mystery. I don't mean to say that to sound mysterious, it's literally true. Like, there are no records. We have no idea what's going on, but we can take inspiration from something for which we do have records. So there's a book whose author, don't have my notes, afraid I'm forgetting it off the top of my head, called Country Driving, from a correspondent for the Washington Post based in Beijing, and he documents a series of road trips, illicit and otherwise, that he takes throughout China. And in one of the chapters, he ends up in this city. This is Lishui, a small factory town in China. And he met some factory owners there, factory owners who made these. So some people in the room will recognize this, the men will not. these are nylon rings for bra straps. He found a factory that made these, and he didn't find one, he didn't find dozens, he found way more than that. Basically, the entire city is devoted to the manufacturing of nylon rings for bra straps. You might think, that's a really interesting source of economic activity. Is there that much demand for it? And the answer is yeah, there is. What happened is, one resident of the city, I forget the exact nature of the story, but found an opportunity. Right? He came across machines to make these things, he came across the expertise to operate those machines, and he found buyers for his product. And before long, he had more buyers than he knew what to do with. He had a demand that far exceeded his ability to increase supply. What did he do? He couldn't afford the capital outlay to expand his factory, to buy more machines, to build bigger space. That just wasn't even the product. So, wasn't even in his future. So he gave the plans and the leads to his friends and his neighbors and his relations. And they went and opened up factories. And they started making these things too. And as they saw that there's still more demand than they had supply for, they did the same thing. And it spread over and over and over again until the entire city is nothing but a factory for making these things. Right? They're all making a great living. You know, they're all got more supply or more demand than they know what to do with. And we could probably tell a very similar story about the GY6, right? Again, the origins are murky. Some people claim the GY6 engine originated with this guy. This is a Suzuki Skywave. It did not make it to America, and it certainly didn't make it to Europe. But it was Suzuki's foray into inexpensive four-stroke scooters. It's very difficult to say, but it may well be that the engine originated here. This was made in China, and it may well be that a factory owner who made parts or made the whole engine saw that there is more demand than he could supply, shared the plans with his neighbor, another factory opens up, right? And the process repeats and continues. Now, one question you may have is, why would you do that? Why would you share this with other people? And the reason is, it spreads risk, right? If I expand my operation at significant capital cost to myself, and then the demand collapses, like, I've shot myself in the foot, right? But if I get my friend to open up another factory, he takes on the capital costs, he takes on the risk. If the demand shrinks up, well, it's on him. I still got my leads, right? But interestingly, it has the effect of creating a network of people who are trying to work together and cooperate. So again, here's the GY6. It actually comes in probably a dozen different forms now. It was one engine. Now it's literally an engine platform. It comes in 50 cc, it comes in 150 cc, it comes in short arm, it comes in long arm. You can get high performance carburetors. You can get literally whatever option you want, right? It's a very modular platform. It's very easy to make refinements to the design. And when refinements are made to the design, they get spread from factory to factory, just like the recipes spread in Chinese food. Right, but the difference is there's no central clearinghouse for this, not as far as I know, not as far as we can tell. This is all spread by word of mouth, right? I go to my friend and say, hey, I just figured out something I could do to improve this engine. Let me pass it on to your engineer, and you can take advantage of this too. And then there's going to be even more demand, and then we can get Bob in on this too. All right, the result is a proliferation of engines, but not just that, it's a proliferation of aftermarket kits. Right? There's an entire industry of people just making spare parts to make your GY6 engine that much beefier. And then there's an entire economy and people providing information on how to do that, how to install a GY6 in your scooter, how to make your GY6 more powerful, right? How to install one of these aftermarket kits, how to go on Alibaba and buy the parts and whatnot that you need. So now there's an entire ecosystem around this GY6 platform that involves much, much more than just the original factory that created it. It's incredible. What are the takeaways? Copies are cheap. Like, it's actually beneficial in this case to share your designs with your neighbors, spread the risk around, and reap the benefits of distributed innovation, right? So you share excess demand, and you decentralize production. There's no one place that makes a GY6. There's no one place that you can point to and say, they originated it. That factory probably doesn't even exist anymore, and the question doesn't mean anything. Instead, get everybody making it, and now everybody's working on it together, and everybody is reaping the benefits. So enough about Chinese food and motor scooters. Let's talk about Linux again. There is precedent for this in the open source community, and it's in Linux distributions. Linux distributions. There are a lot of Linux distributions out there. There's so many. And they work on exactly this model, right? There are some common threads to some of the distributions. There's a number of them that are based on Red Hat. Many of them are based on Slackware in some way. Many of them are based on Debian. Many of them are not based on anything at all. They're just their own thing, sui generis, right? In some sense, they're not really interchangeable, right? You can't just shift from CentOS to Debian. There are consequences that you have to take into account. But the structure of a Linux distribution is incredibly modular, right? And we understand how the pieces fit together. We understand what pieces are necessary, what the alternatives are, right? And this makes distributed innovation very, very possible, and that's exactly what we see, right? We see hundreds, if not thousands, of organizations working on making Linux distributions better, and they do this by figuring out what's right for their local market conditions, making the tweaks that are necessary, and then sharing their knowledge. So this can happen with open source, but we don't see it very much. So that rain is incredible. Copies are cheap. Share excess demand with your neighbor. And decentralize production. And reap the benefits. Thank you.